The night my flight got cancelled, I thought I'd lost a few hours of sleep and maybe a client's patience. But what I actually lost was the version of my life I thought was real, because if that plane had taken off on time, I would have been 1,500 miles away while my wife sat in our living room planning a future that didn't include me. My name is Daniel Carter, I'm 39 years old, and until that night, I believed in predictable things, flight schedules, quarterly reports, the way my wife Sophia would text me goodnight when I was out of town, simple rhythms that made a marriage feel steady even when distance stretched it thin. I remember standing at gate B12 at O'Hare, staring at the delay board as the word cancelled flickered into place like a quiet verdict, the kind you don't argue with because there's no one to argue to, just a line of tired passengers and a storm system rolling in from the west. I sighed, checked my watch, 9:47 p.m., too late to rebook anything meaningful, too early to call it a night, and for a second I considered grabbing a hotel room, maybe a bourbon at the bar, something to make the inconvenience feel smaller. But something nudged me, not instinct exactly, more like a loose thread you notice and can't stop pulling, and instead of staying, I booked the first return flight home, a red-eye that would land me back before sunrise, a decision that felt practical in the moment, and irreversible now when I think about it. The house was quiet when I pulled into the driveway, quieter than it should have been, the kind of silence that doesn't settle right in your chest, and I remember noticing the porch light was off even though Sophia always left it on when I traveled, a small thing, easy to explain, except it didn't feel small. I let myself in, dropped my carry-on by the door, and stood there for a second, listening, because after years of marriage you learn the sounds of your own home, the hum of the fridge, the soft creak of floorboards, the way presence leaves traces even when no one's speaking. Everything looked normal until it didn't. There were 2 wine glasses on the kitchen counter, one with a faint ring of red at the bottom, the other barely touched, like someone had been waiting, or maybe hesitating. I told myself it could be anything, a friend stopping by, a late-night call that turned into a glass of wine, the kind of explanation you reach for when you're not ready for the other one. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Sophia, timestamped 20 minutes earlier. Long night, going to bed early. Talk tomorrow. I stared at the message, then at the glass, then back at the message, and something in me shifted, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet recalibration, like a compass needle adjusting to a truth it hadn't wanted to point to. I walked further into the house, slower now, noticing details I would have missed any other night. The faint scent of perfume that wasn't new but felt stronger, the throw blanket on the couch folded too neatly, like it had been reset after being used. People think betrayal arrives like a storm, loud and impossible to ignore, but sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it's just a series of small things that don't line up, and the moment you realize they don't, you can't make them fit again. I didn't call out her name, didn't turn on the lights, didn't announce I was home, because something told me the version of the night she expected was not the one that was actually happening, and for the first time in a long time, I decided to see it all the way through before I said a single word. I moved through the house like I was walking into someone else's version of my life, careful not to disturb anything, because the moment you touch it, the story changes, and I needed to see it exactly as it was. The hallway light was off, but a faint glow slipped out from under the office door, thin and steady, like someone had been there not long ago. Sophia never worked that late at home, not unless she had a deadline, and she would have mentioned that, she always did, little updates that made distance feel smaller. I stood there for a second, listening, hearing nothing but the low hum of the air conditioning and my own breathing, slower than it should have been, like my body already knew something my mind was still trying to deny. When I pushed the door open, it did not creak. It never did, and the room looked almost untouched at first glance, laptop closed, chair tucked in, everything aligned in that neat, deliberate way Sophia preferred. But it was the kind of neat that felt recent, like it had been reset, not lived in. I stepped closer to the desk, ran my fingers lightly across the surface, and felt the warmth before I even registered it, a subtle heat left behind by something that had just been active. That was the moment the loose thread pulled tighter. I told myself to stop, to walk away, to wait until morning and ask her directly, Because that is what people do when they trust each other. They ask, they listen, they believe. But trust is fragile once it starts to crack, and I could already feel the fracture spreading. I opened the laptop. The screen flickered to life without asking for a password, which was unusual. Sophia never left it unlocked, not even for a minute, and for a second I just stared at the desktop, clean, organized, nothing out of place, like a room staged for a showing. Everything looked normal until I noticed what was missing. No open documents, no recent tabs, no trace of whatever had been happening before I walked in. Too clean. I moved the cursor slowly, almost carefully, like I was afraid the truth might disappear if I rushed it, and opened the browser history. At first it was ordinary, news sites, work portals, a recipe page she had probably used earlier, but then the timestamps shifted, clustered closer together, all within the last hour, and the URLs stopped looking familiar. They were not explicit, not obvious, just names you would not recognize unless you knew what you were looking at: private forums, discussion threads, pages that did not belong to the life we had built. My chest tightened, not from shock, but from recognition, because even without context, you can feel when something is wrong. I clicked one of the entries. The page loaded slowly, like it was giving me time to change my mind, and for a second I almost closed it, and walked out and chose ignorance over clarity. But then the text appeared, and I saw her name. Not just her name, but her words laid out in a thread that had nothing to do with me, nothing to do with us, discussing boundaries, expectations, timelines, the kind of language people use when they are planning something, not stumbling into it. My hand stayed steady, which surprised me, because inside, everything felt like it was shifting, like the ground had moved a few inches and I was the only one who noticed. I kept reading, not fast, not slow, just enough to understand that this was not an accident, not a moment of weakness, but a conversation that had been building over time, structured, intentional, and somewhere between the lines I realized something worse than the affair itself. This was not about secrecy. This was about replacement. I kept scrolling, not because I wanted to know more, but because I needed to understand how far this had gone without me noticing, and the further I went, the clearer the pattern became. Timestamps stretching back weeks, maybe months, conversations layered on top of each other like they had been carefully maintained, not hidden in panic but organized with intention. Sophia was not reacting to something that happened, she was building towards something, piece by piece, and the language she used was calm, measured, almost clinical, the kind of tone people adopt when they believe they are making a reasonable decision. She talked about transition phases, about honesty frameworks, about how traditional expectations were limiting, and every sentence felt like it had been rehearsed, refined, shaped long before I ever walked into that room. I stopped on one message thread that stood out from the rest, not because it was louder or more emotional, but because it was specific, directed, not a general discussion but a conversation with someone, a name that appeared more than once, consistently, like a fixed point in everything else that shifted. There were no explicit words, nothing that crossed a line you could easily point to, but the implication was there in the rhythm of it, in the familiarity, in the way plans were referenced without being fully explained, as if both sides already understood what was being said without needing to spell it out. That was when it settled in, not all at once, but in layers, like the weight of something pressing down slowly until you realize you cannot ignore it anymore. This was not just about her stepping outside the marriage. This was about her redefining it without me. I leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under my weight, and for the first time since I walked into the house, I felt something close to clarity. Not anger, not yet, and not even disbelief, because disbelief requires a part of you to reject what you are seeing, and I was past that point. This was real. It had been real for a while. And the only thing I had not realized until now was how deliberate it all was. I looked around the office again, at the framed photos on the shelf, vacations, holidays, moments that once felt like anchors, and suddenly they looked different, like snapshots from a version of the story that had already been rewritten somewhere else. People say you can tell when something is wrong in a relationship, that there are signs, shifts, changes in tone or behavior, But the truth is, sometimes the signs are there and you choose not to read them, because the alternative is too disruptive, too uncomfortable to confront. I thought about the last few months, the late nights she explained away as work, the new phrases she used in conversations that I brushed off as trends or articles she had read, the subtle distance that I told myself was normal, something couples go through. Looking back, it was all there, just not in a way that forced me to see it. And that was the most unsettling part. She had not been careless. She had been careful. Careful enough to let me believe everything was still intact while she quietly prepared for something else. My eyes drifted back to the screen, to a line that had been easy to miss the first time, a sentence tucked between larger ideas, but now it stood out with a kind of quiet certainty. He travels often, which makes the timing easier. I read it again, slower this time, letting each word settle, and for a moment the room felt smaller, like the walls had shifted inward without making a sound. That was me. Not mentioned by name, not directly addressed, but present in the margins of a plan I had never agreed to. I exhaled slowly, steady, controlled, because reactions matter, even when no one is watching, and I understood something then that changed the direction of everything that would come next. She thought she was ahead of me. She thought the timeline was hers to control. What she did not know was that the timeline had already changed the moment I walked through that door. I did not close the laptop right away, not because I needed more proof, but because closing it would have meant accepting that I had seen enough, and I was not ready to step into that next version of reality just yet. Instead, I memorized what mattered, the names, the phrasing, the tone she used when she thought no one was looking, because there is a difference between suspicion and certainty, and once you cross that line, you do not get to go back. I opened my phone and quietly took photos of the screen, one after another, steady hands, no hesitation, making sure each detail was captured exactly as it appeared, because I had learned something in that moment that most people only realize too late. Memory can be questioned, but evidence cannot. When I finally closed the laptop, the soft click sounded louder than it should have, like a signal that something irreversible had just happened, even though the house remained as quiet as before. I stood there for a second, letting the silence settle, then moved through the house again, this time with a different awareness, noticing how everything fit together in a way that supported her version of events, not mine. The guest room was untouched, the bed made perfectly, no sign of anyone staying over, which meant whatever had happened, or was happening, did not leave obvious traces behind. That was consistent with everything I had seen so far, careful, controlled, intentional. I checked the front door, still locked from the inside, then the garage, empty except for her car, parked exactly where it always was, like nothing about tonight had been out of the ordinary. And that was the point. From the outside, nothing was wrong. From the inside, everything was. I walked back into the kitchen and looked at the 2 wine glasses again, this time paying attention to what I had missed before, the difference in how they were placed, one closer to the sink, the other near the edge of the counter, like it had been set down mid-conversation and never moved again. Small details, but they matter, because they tell you what people do when they are not thinking about being watched. I rinsed both glasses slowly, not out of habit, but because I did not want her to know I had seen them, and as the water ran, I realized something that shifted everything into place. She was planning to tell me. Not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. The way she wrote, the way she framed everything, it was not about hiding forever, it was about timing, about choosing the moment that would give her the most control over the outcome. That meant I was not reacting to something that had already happened. I was standing at the edge of something that had not been revealed yet. I dried my hands, turned off the kitchen light, and leaned against the counter, thinking through what that meant. If I confronted her now, I would be stepping into her timeline, reacting exactly the way she had likely anticipated, emotional, unprepared, giving her the advantage. If I waited, if I said nothing, then the dynamic shifted, even if she did not realize it yet. For the first time that night, I felt something solid settle in my chest, not relief, not anger, but direction. This was no longer about discovering the truth. I already had that. This was about what I did with it. And as I stood there in the quiet of a house that suddenly felt unfamiliar, I understood that whatever came next would not be decided by what she planned, but by how long I was willing to let her believe she was still in control. I did not go to bed that night, not because I could not, but because sleep would have meant letting my guard down, and something in me had already shifted into a different mode, one that does not rest when there is too much at stake. Instead, I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the faint outline of the street through the window, the occasional headlights passing by like nothing in the world had changed, even though everything had. Around 2:13. In the morning, I heard the soft click of the front door unlocking, careful, controlled, the way someone enters when they believe no one is waiting for them. I did not move. I did not speak. I just listened. Her footsteps were light, measured, heels in one hand, the quiet tap of them against the wall as she set them down, followed by the familiar sound of her keys placed gently on the console table. "Daniel?" she called softly, not too loud, just enough to confirm the house was empty the way she expected. I stayed still, letting the silence answer for me. A few seconds passed, then she exhaled, a subtle release, like tension leaving her body now that the performance could drop. I heard her move toward the kitchen, the faint clink of glass as she noticed the counter, then a pause, longer than the others, the kind that only happens when something does not match memory. "That is strange," she murmured under her breath, and I could almost see her scanning the room, recalculating details she thought she had left in place. That was when I stood up, slow enough not to startle her, but deliberate enough that she could not mistake it for anything else. "Yeah," I said calmly, my voice steady. "It is strange." She turned so quickly that for a split second, the mask slipped, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I did, because I was looking for it. Surprise first, sharp and unfiltered, then recognition, then the immediate rebuild, the practiced composure sliding back into place like nothing had happened. "Daniel? You are home early," she said, her tone almost perfect, just a fraction too measured, like she was buying time while her mind caught up. I nodded once, keeping my posture relaxed, giving her nothing to react to. "Flight got cancelled," I replied, simple, factual, no emotion attached. She stepped closer, searching my face for something, a clue, a reaction, anything that would tell her how much I knew, and for a moment I understood how important this silence was. People reveal themselves when they think they need to fill the space. "You should have told me," she said, a faint smile forming, the kind that tries to smooth over unexpected changes. "I would have stayed up." I held her gaze just long enough to make the point without saying it. "I did not want to wake you," I answered, and that was the truth, just not in the way she thought. There was a brief pause, small, almost invisible, but it carried weight, because in that pause, two different versions of the night existed, hers and mine, and neither of us was stepping into the other's yet. She nodded slowly, accepting the explanation on the surface, even if something underneath it did not fully settle. "Long day?" I asked, keeping the conversation moving, letting her build her version of events. She glanced toward the kitchen, then back at me, and I watched the decision happen in real time, what to say, what to leave out, how to shape the story. "Just work," she replied, casual, controlled. "Nothing exciting." I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because of how precise the lie was, how it fit perfectly into the space she needed it to occupy. I stepped past her toward the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water, giving her a moment to watch me instead. "Good," I said quietly, taking a sip, then setting the glass down with care. "I am glad everything is normal." The word hung there for a second, light on the surface, heavier underneath, and I saw it land, not fully understood, but not ignored either. She studied me again, more carefully this time, like she was trying to decide if something had shifted, and I knew then that this was the beginning of something neither of us could stop anymore. The difference was, she still thought she was the one leading it. The rest of the night unfolded in a way that would have felt ordinary to anyone else, and that was the unsettling part, because nothing on the surface broke, nothing forced a confrontation, everything stayed within the lines of what a normal evening should look like, even though both of us were standing on completely different ground. Sophia moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, pouring herself water, asking small questions about my trip that no longer mattered, her tone steady, her posture relaxed, the version of her I had known for years, except now I could see the structure behind it, the way each response was measured, the way she watched me between sentences, not obviously, but enough to read the space I was giving her. I answered just as carefully, not evasive, not defensive, just neutral, letting the conversation exist without pushing it anywhere, because I understood something she did not yet realize: silence can be more powerful than confrontation when the other person is expecting you to react. We stood there for a few minutes that felt longer than they should have, exchanging normal words that carried different meanings underneath, and eventually she excused herself, saying she was exhausted, that it had been a long day, the same explanation she had already given, consistent, controlled, and almost believable if I had not already seen the other version of her night. I nodded, watched her walk down the hallway, and listened to the bedroom door close softly behind her, the sound final in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I stayed in the kitchen a little longer, letting the quiet settle again, then turned off the last light and walked to the guest room instead of our bedroom, not because I was avoiding her, but because I needed distance, not physical, but mental, space to think without her presence shaping my reactions. I sat on the edge of the bed and went over everything again, not the emotional part, but the structure, the timeline, the details that mattered, because if this was going to unfold the way I suspected, then what I did next would determine how it ended. She had a plan, that much was clear, a sequence of conversations, a way of presenting it that would make her position seem reasonable, something she could defend, maybe even something she believed I would accept if framed the right way. That meant she was not expecting resistance immediately, she was expecting confusion, questions, maybe even an attempt to understand, and that assumption was her biggest blind spot. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time since I walked into the house, I allowed myself to think beyond the moment, to consider the outcome, not in terms of what she wanted, but in terms of what I was willing to accept. The answer came quicker than I expected, not dramatic, not fueled by anger, just clear. I was not going to step into a version of marriage that I had never agreed to, no matter how calmly it was presented, no matter how logically it was explained. That decision settled something in me, not fully, but enough to give direction to everything that would come next. I reached for my phone, opened the photos I had taken, and looked at them again, not because I needed to confirm what I had seen, but because I needed to anchor myself in it, to make sure that when the conversation finally happened, I would not second-guess the reality of it. Evidence has a way of cutting through doubt, and I knew there would be moments where doubt tried to creep in, where the familiarity of our life would make me question what I had already understood. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to reset, to prepare, because the next phase was not about discovery anymore, it was about execution, about letting her believe the timing was still hers while I quietly moved ahead of it. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear the faint sound of movement, the bed shifting, a door opening and closing, normal sounds that used to mean comfort, now just markers of proximity, reminders that the person I thought I knew was still there, just not in the way I had believed. And as the night stretched into morning, one thought stayed consistent, steady, and impossible to ignore: she was still building her version of the truth, and I was already preparing to dismantle it. Morning did not arrive the way it usually did, with routine and familiarity easing the transition from night to day. Instead it came quietly, almost cautiously, like the house itself was aware that something had shifted and was waiting to see how we would handle it. I woke before my alarm, not because I had slept well, but because my mind never fully shut down, and for a moment I just lay there in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, letting the stillness settle before I stepped back into the version of reality we were about to perform. When I walked into the kitchen, Sophia was already there, dressed for the day, coffee in hand, her posture composed, her expression neutral, the same version of her that had greeted the world for years, efficient, put together, in control. "You are up early," she said, her tone light, almost casual, like last night had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. I nodded, reaching for a mug, moving through the motions without thinking, because sometimes routine is the easiest way to maintain balance when everything underneath it is unstable. Could not sleep much, I replied, which was true, just not for the reason she might assume. She studied me briefly, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to register that something was different, even if she could not define it yet. You should take it easy today, she added, turning back to her coffee, giving me space, or maybe giving herself space. I was not entirely sure which. I poured the coffee, watched the dark liquid settle, and realized how ordinary this moment would look to anyone else. Two people starting their day, nothing out of place, nothing worth questioning. But underneath that surface, two separate timelines were running side by side, hers moving toward a conversation she believed she controlled, mine already positioned beyond it. We sat at the table across from each other, exchanging small talk, schedules, meetings, the kind of conversation that fills space without meaning anything, and I let her lead it, let her build the normalcy she needed to feel secure. Every now and then, she would pause just slightly, like she was deciding whether to say something more, testing the timing, measuring the moment, and each time, she pulled back, choosing to wait. That confirmed what I already knew: she was not ready yet, which meant I had time, and time was something she thought she owned. After a few minutes, she checked her phone, stood up, and gathered her things, her movements efficient, practiced, like she had done this 1,000 times before, because she had. I might be late tonight, she said, adjusting her bag on her shoulder, her voice steady, offering the information in a way that sounded routine, expected. I met her eyes, held them just long enough to register the statement, then nodded once. That is fine, I replied, keeping my tone even, giving her no reason to question anything. There was a brief pause, a fraction of a second where something almost surfaced, something unspoken, but it passed, replaced by the same composed expression she had maintained since I walked in. See you tonight, she said, stepping toward the door, and I watched her leave, the soft click of the door closing behind her marking the start of a different phase, one where her absence gave me the space to move without being observed. I waited a few minutes after her car pulled out of the driveway, then stood up, the calm I had maintained settling into something more focused, more deliberate. This was no longer about reacting or observing, it was about preparation, about making sure that when the conversation finally happened, I was not stepping into it unprepared. I walked back into the office, opened the laptop again, and this time I did not hesitate, because hesitation belonged to the version of me that still believed there might be a misunderstanding. That version was gone. What remained was someone who understood exactly what was at stake and exactly how carefully it needed to be handled. And as the screen lit up again, I realized something that made everything even clearer. She had been planning her version of the truth for weeks, maybe longer, but she had made one mistake: she assumed I would only see it when she decided to show me. She did not account for what would happen if I saw it first. I did not rush, not because I was unsure, but because rushing would have meant reacting, and I was past that point now. Everything I did had to be deliberate, controlled, the same way she had been building her version of this situation for weeks. I moved through the office with purpose, opening files, checking timestamps, following threads she assumed no one else would trace, and the more I uncovered, the clearer the structure became. Not just conversations, but a framework, a plan that extended beyond emotions into logistics, finances, living arrangements, even how the conversation would be presented to me when the time came. She had thought this through carefully, patiently, and for a moment, I almost respected the precision of it, the level of detail it took to construct something like this without raising suspicion. Almost. I copied what mattered, saved it in places she would never think to look, external drives, secure folders, backups layered on backups, because once you understand the scale of something, you do not take chances with how you handle it. By late morning, I stepped away from the desk and sat back, letting everything settle into place, not emotionally, but strategically, because this was no longer about what I felt, it was about what I would do. The pattern was clear now. She was preparing to introduce the idea gradually, frame it as a discussion, position it as something modern, something reasonable, something that would evolve our marriage rather than break it, and in her version of events, I would be surprised, maybe resistant at first, but ultimately drawn into the conversation on her terms. That was the assumption she had built everything on, and that assumption was the weakness in her plan. I stood up and walked through the house again, not looking for more evidence, but recalibrating my perspective, seeing it the way it actually was, not the way I had believed it to be. Every room felt slightly different now, not physically, but in meaning, like the context had shifted just enough to change everything without altering the surface. I paused in the living room, looked at the space where we had spent countless evenings, conversations that felt real at the time, and I realized something that settled deeper than anything else. She had already moved on in her mind. This was just the phase where she aligned reality with that decision. That meant the conversation she was planning was not about asking, it was about informing, about presenting a path she had already chosen. And that clarified my role in all of this. I was not there to negotiate terms I had never agreed to. I was there to decide how I exited something that had already been redefined without me. I checked the time, early afternoon now, and for the first time since the night before, I allowed myself to step outside, the air cool, steady, grounding in a way the house no longer was. I stood there for a minute, looking at the street, the same one I had looked at countless times before, except now it felt like a boundary between two versions of my life, one that ended quietly without warning, and one that was just beginning to take shape. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and made the first call that mattered, not to confront, not to explain, but to prepare, because whatever happened next would not be decided in a single conversation, it would unfold over time, and I intended to be ready for every part of it. When I hung up, I did not feel relief, I did not feel anger, I felt something steadier, something more controlled, the kind of focus that only comes when uncertainty is replaced with direction. I walked back inside, closed the door behind me, and for the first time, the house did not feel like a place I was trying to understand. It felt like a place I was preparing to leave, even if the timing had not been revealed yet. And as I stood there in the quiet, one thought stayed clear: she believed she was about to change the rules of our marriage, but she had not considered that I might decide to stop playing the game entirely. She came home later than usual that evening, not dramatically late, not enough to raise suspicion on its own, just outside the range of routine, the kind of delay that would have passed without question any other week, any other version of me. I was already there, sitting in the living room with the lights dimmed, a single lamp on, the television running low in the background without sound, the kind of setting that signals normalcy without demanding attention. When the door opened, I did not look up right away. I let her step inside, let her settle into the space she thought she understood before I acknowledged her presence. "Hey," she said, her voice measured, carrying just enough warmth to feel familiar, and I could hear the slight shift in her tone when she saw me already home, already waiting, not in a confrontational way, just present. "Hey," I replied, matching her tone, keeping everything level, because tone sets the stage before words ever do. She set her bag down, moved through the room with the same composed efficiency she had maintained all day, and I watched her carefully, not searching for guilt, but for alignment, whether the person standing in front of me matched the version I had seen on that screen. "Long day?" I asked, giving her the opening, letting her step into the narrative she had prepared. She nodded, a small, controlled motion, then exhaled lightly as she sat down across from me. "Yeah, meetings ran over, you know how it is," she said, the explanation smooth, practiced, almost automatic. I held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, not enough to challenge, just enough to register, then nodded once. "I do," I said, and for a moment the room settled into a quiet that felt different from before, heavier, more aware. She leaned back slightly, studying me in a way she probably thought was subtle, trying to read what had changed, if anything had changed, and I could see the moment she made a decision, not fully conscious, but present, a shift from waiting to initiating. "Daniel," she started, her tone softening just enough to signal importance. "There is something I have been meaning to talk to you about." There it was, exactly where I knew it would be, not rushed, not forced, introduced with care, like something that deserved space and understanding. I did not interrupt, did not react. I simply nodded, giving her permission to continue, because stopping her now would have meant stepping into her structure, and I was not there to follow her plan. She took a breath, not nervous, but measured, like she had rehearsed this moment more than once. I have been doing a lot of thinking lately, she continued, her words deliberate, each one placed with intention. About us, about what we want, about how relationships evolve over time. I listened, not to the content, but to the framing, because the framing is where the truth hides when the words are designed to guide you somewhere. And I feel like we have reached a point where we should be honest about what we need moving forward, she added, watching me closely now, waiting for a reaction, a question, anything that would confirm she was still leading this conversation. I let the silence stretch for just a second, not long enough to create tension, just enough to shift it, then leaned forward slightly, resting my hands together, calm, steady, grounded. You are right, I said quietly, and I saw it in her eyes, the brief flicker of validation, the assumption that I was aligning with her direction. That was when I placed the phone on the table between us, screen facing up, the images already open, clear, undeniable, not thrown down, not used as a weapon, just set there with intention. The air in the room changed instantly, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be ignored, like a current shifting direction beneath still water. Her eyes moved to the screen, then back to me, then back again, and for the first time since I walked into that house the night before, the composure cracked, not completely, but enough to reveal what had been hidden underneath. I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse, I did not ask questions that no longer mattered. I just met her gaze, steady, unshaken, and spoke the only sentence that mattered. You should have told me sooner, I said, my voice calm, controlled, final. Because now it is not a conversation anymore. The silence that followed was different from any silence we had shared before, not empty, not uncertain, but decisive, because in that moment, the timeline she had built, the plan she had carefully constructed, all of it collapsed into something simpler, something she had not prepared for. And as I stood up, leaving the phone where it was, I realized something with absolute clarity. She thought she was about to redefine our marriage, but what she had actually done was end it before she ever got the chance to explain why.